we are certainly hard pressed for time. Don't go to sleep. This is a subject area that is not as technical as what we have been listening to. You might say that it is an arena in which we deploy software in order to preserve not only it, but also to ensure that it is accessible to as many people as possible. The Memory of the World program was set up in 1992, and for me to highlight its importance, I probably need to introduce you to what is called the 2015 recommendation concerning the preservation of and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form. This is a UNESCO standard-setting instrument which was adopted by its member states in 2015. It carves out 5 key areas of intervention for the Memory of the World program, and I think these provide the bedrock of our Memory of the World panel today. In a nutshell, linked to documentary heritage, including in its digital form, the 5 areas of intervention are captured by 5 operative words: identification, preservation, access, policy, and cooperation. With that, I would like to welcome 3 guests that to varying degrees will speak to aspects of the 2015 recommendation. Physically here with me is Dr. Charles Henry, who is the president of the Council on Library and Information Resources. And online, we've got 2 speakers, the first of whom is Anthea Seles, who is the university archivist for McGill University in Canada. And we also have David Brock, who is the director of Curatorial Affairs at the Computer History Museum. So I think it might be useful to start with you, Charles. Charles is going to share some thoughts on leveraging the so-called Hidden Collections Africa initiative through sustainable infrastructure.
Right. Thank you, Fackson. And as Fackson said, this is an attempted application using open source advanced software to promote cultural preservation, facilitate education, and also to promote scientific literacy. The title of this project is Hidden Collections Africa. And we're going to talk about the design of this project and its aspirations. I'm going to go through these slides very quickly because of time, and then you can look at them in more detail if you'd like. Next. Very briefly, climate change is real. It's unfortunate that I have to put this slide up so often in my country, but we will leave that uncontested and move on to the next slide, please. Hidden Collections Africa is the main purpose is to engage younger generations to respond to climate change through advanced software and intergenerational training. That's it in a nutshell. This is what we call generative sustainability, and I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. Next slide, please. Some background to this. We are focusing largely on younger generations. This is some of the responses to a survey that was taken. These are U.S. students. These are younger people, this about age 18 to 25. But these results are fully consonant with many, many other surveys taken around the world in different regions and different countries. The surveyors came out with these results. Of the students, there were several thousand students interviewed on the effects, the negative effects of climate change on future generations, 84%. And these are worried, this is deeply worried. On the future deleterious effects on society, 79%. Deleterious, detrimental effects on the future quality of life, 77%. 55% had what is called eco-anxiety, which is a very heightened sense that can involve depression and other kinds of trauma, actually, physical and mental trauma. And one of the conclusions was from this group, again, consonant with other surveys, the actions that we are taking towards climate change are not effective. So and this is just obviously a thumbnail of a very long survey, but think of the energy involved in this. But this younger generation wants to do something, trying to do something, doesn't have the opportunity to do it, and is uniformly anxious and worried about the future. Next slide, please. So Hidden Collections Africa is designed to engage students and young people to capture images of their cultural heritage that's threatened or damaged, or threatened with loss or damage by climate change. In Africa, the institutions that have approached us, the potential loss in some areas is over 80%, and that's through desertification, through rising water, flooding, wildfires. Insect infestation is prominent as well. And there's also cultural loss that's associated with the diaspora of tens and tens of millions of people are predicted to be displaced in the continent over the next 20 to 30 years. With that is the loss of more intangible culture, languages, ritual, performance, ancestral memory, and such. We'd like at some point to build a community of maybe 10 million, maybe more, involved with this. Next slide. Quickly, the design is action-focused. We hope to expand this globally. We hope this to be a project that lasts 100 years, over several generations. This is not a regular project. This is not, 5 years, here's your funding, give us an annual report. This is something that has to be durable. Scholarship, the rigorous scholarship is an emphasis of this, integrating the resources, the cultural resources, and the scientific information captured through this project are intended to be integrated very quickly into curricula, into school, into teaching, and also into research. And that integration is key to this. And we also are trying to take advantage of emergent technologies, which is parcel to the conference today. Next slide, please. How we do it? Briefly, we were approached by about 500 institutions in Africa. We have signed MOUs with them. Most of the images, we believe, will be captured by smartphones, by the younger people who've been trained. The images will be uploaded to what looks like a central platform. Metadata will be applied quickly and then augmented over time. Our teams, various teams on the continent and elsewhere in Europe, in the US, will create tools and applications designed for more effective reuse of this material. Again, integrating it into teaching and research. And we have a field guide, which will come out, I hope, in the next couple of months, that will give you, you can look through it. There'll be a digital version of it, and there'll be some physical versions of it. It's meant to look kind of crummy. This is not a glossy project. This is get down and let's get to work. And that field guide will come out initially in 15 languages. We expect it will eventually come out in about 250. Next slide. That's the technical stack, and I will not go into detail with this group, but the slide is there. It's on GitHub, and it is open source, and we've used it for a number of other projects. It's augmented and enhanced just about every week. Our main partners are Princeton University and Stanford University on this. But again, you can peruse this in more detail at your leisure, and I'm available for any questions subsequent to the conference, as is the CIO and others involved with this, to give you an idea of how this is constructed and why. Next slide. So generative sustainability is a key point here. Sustainability and infrastructure are social constructions in this project. It's not just infrastructure as routers and servers and optical fibers and satellite connections. And sustainability is not just some funder throwing money at you every 3 years or 5 years. This is socially constructed. Engagement with well-trained young people across generations, integrating resources into teaching, research, and curious inquiry. That provides the basic structure, focus, continuity, and long-term durability of this effort. The next slide. So in conclusion, we're not trying to solve, nor could we, climate change, but creating a living environment that fosters better understanding of the crisis, builds large-scale global communities of purpose and practice, sustains culture that's currently and predicted to be under threat, gives voice to those presently unable to contribute, hopefully facilitates more informed decision-making, and motivates by encouraging and respecting our shared human nature. Last slide. I think it is the last slide. A flick of the wrist. So that's an image I just wanted to leave you with today. Consonant, I think, with the conversations that Fackson and I have had and others. And the image is this, that it's estimated every day 5.2 billion selfies are taken. That's a lot of snaps, man. And all we're asking is just a really small percentage of that population to turn that phone and focus on their culture. And by doing that, get a different sense of self and purpose. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charles. I would like to, come to grips with the concept of generative sustainability. Very interesting. Anthea, we would like you to, come on now. We commissioned Anthea to do a desk study of how AI could potentially be deployed in the identification, preservation, and accessibility of documentary heritage. And she's going to share with us some issues emerging from that study. Anthea, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fackson, and thank you to the Software Heritage Symposium for having me today. So I'm going to try and keep this quite brief and give you an overview of what I've discovered as part of my research. Can I have the next slide? So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the publication, some of the topics that we'll be discussing. As a second point, what I'd like to emphasize over the course of this presentation is AI as record. I think I'm talking to a room that has already recognized the importance of artificial intelligence, of documenting artificial intelligence. But I think there's also a piece of artificial intelligence as a historical record in and of itself. And how do we ensure the continued accessibility and preservation of that material over time? Talking a little bit about preserving AI, some of the emerging thoughts, I think, coming from the archives community, in particular, the Interpares research project on artificial intelligence. But I think there's quite a few areas of collaboration with the Software Heritage Network in a documentary heritage profession in general about how do we start to tackle the preservation of AI in the long term for various reasons, which I will get into over the course of the presentation. Then I'll touch on other areas where there's been AI deployed in documentary heritage, some of the issues and concerns, both from an ethical point of view and a practical point of view, in the deployment and use of these pieces of software within the documentary heritage environment. And then finally, I will sum up the presentation. Next slide. So an overview a little bit about the publication itself. So documentary heritage and AI approaches and considerations was not only desk research, but was also about providing practical approaches for documentary heritage institutions and organizations on the use of AI. So midway through my career, when I was working at the National Archives of the United Kingdom, we had two major issues that we needed to tackle. One was, how do we make sense of large unstructured collections of information? So a lot of our government departments had just running sequences of records in their shared drives, or had a really idiosyncratic file folder naming conventions, which made it very difficult for government departments then to be able to identify what is the extant record, historical record that eventually needed to be transferred to the National Archives. And then secondly, what in that material is open redacted, or closed. So this is sensitivity review. And so we needed to start testing at a very basic level. We were using basic supervised machine learning to be able to develop methodologies and approaches to help our government departments. And so what this report does is reflect some of the research I did, as well as current research within the profession around these particular topics. Also discussed, and this is in line with the 2015 recommendations and the different areas of the 2015 recommendations that Fackson had discussed, I touched on policy frameworks necessary to support documentary heritage institutions as they look to deploy these technologies within their own environment. Oftentimes, documentary heritage is the last institution on the list when it comes to technology and considerations by a lot of governments. And oftentimes there's an expectation to deploy new and up and coming technologies without really factoring in the resources, the expertise, and the capabilities that are needed in order to make this useful in our environments. And I will talk a bit about some of the ethical issues if governments don't pay sufficient attention to this, and some of the challenges that will be faced by documentary heritage institutions, and that will be faced when we start trying to document what is the digital historical record of the future. Also talked a bit about cooperation and ethics. And then, like I said, the focus for today really is just trying to convey to you how I've perceived and how I think documentary heritage professionals perceive AI as record, as well as the need to preserve artificial intelligence as a result of that. Next slide. So AI as record. So within the archival world, when we use the term record, what we mean is and in libraries as well, what we mean is something that has to be kept in the long term. So why should AI be kept as record? A lot of governments in private organizations are using artificial intelligence around policy development and are making decisions, as you are probably well aware in this room, that impact the lives of individuals, impact their ability to access services, their ability to assert rights, and it is having a long-term. And these governments need to be more transparent and accountable, as well as these private organizations, for the decisions that they are making using the data that they are using to train artificial intelligence to develop policies and make decisions. Next slide. So these are just some examples. The DWP example, or the Department of Works and Pensions, which is a UK government department, is from 3 years ago, but it shows the use of artificial intelligence in order to, in this case, attempt to curb benefits fraud, but the unintended consequences that some of these deployments have on people. Oftentimes AI disproportionately affects people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and also where there's a power imbalance. And the issue here is, whilst DWP was attempting to ensure that the money that they have is being spent in the right places, it unfortunately was targeting individuals that shouldn't necessarily have been targeted. And then also, how do you demand accountability in some of these circumstances? So particularly I've seen around healthcare insurance administration that oftentimes the output from the AI or the machine learning application around why an expense is covered or not is essentially defaulted to the machine. There's no accountability about why a decision is accepted in one instance and why it isn't in another. And so we need to have, from the archival perspective and the library perspective, better mechanisms to be able to capture and document this so that we can preserve this in the future, to ensure that governments and private organizations are accountable for the decisions that they make that affect the lives of citizens. Next slide. So this is where I wanted to touch a little bit about the importance of preserving artificial intelligence. So we talked a bit about this from the software perspective, but there's a big piece here around accountability and transparency related to decision making. And not only do we need to develop AI in the open, but we also need openness around how companies are using and governments are using data at their disposal to train their software, AI software, to be able to make decisions, again, that affect people's lives. Next slide. So what some of the questions I run up against when I talk about this in the paper, in the report, and this is really where I think having the perspective of the Software Heritage Network is vitally important for documentary heritage professionals, is what do we preserve? How is it preserved? Our current digital preservation practices, which we currently have in our profession, fit for purpose for the care, maintenance, and accessibility, because that's a whole nother component. We can keep stuff, but how do we make it available? The whole point of accountability and transparency is to make it available to citizens, researchers, journalists, whoever, to show and reproduce why certain things have had the impact that they have. So there's a whole issue as well around reproducibility. And how do we sustainably preserve AI? Whilst we have an approach, so paradata and AI preservation is something that has come out of the Interpares AI project, Interpares being the international research on permanent authentic records in electronic systems. These are huge pieces of information that we need to preserve. And how do we do this sustainably? How do we interconnect these things? And how do we make it all accessible? And that is not immediately apparent. And when we look at this from the documentary heritage perspective, is that governments are not always willing to invest the resources necessary to allow documentary heritage organizations to do this kind of large scale preservation. And it will be large scale. And so this is where I think working with networks like the Sustainable Software Heritage Network allows us to make advocacy requests of governments and ensure that we can preserve it. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a bit now about other aspects of documentary heritage and AI that I think the participants in this room should be mindful of. Next slide. So transparency and ethical parameters in the use of AI in documentary heritage. So right now, I would say documentary heritage professionals are working in a bit of an ethical vacuum. Our international professional associations have not really caught up at this point with the impact of artificial intelligence on our practice. IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations, is looking at developing a framework. So that is in course right now. Unfortunately, the International Council on Archives has, as far as I'm aware at this point, has not sought to revitalize or review its code of ethics. And this is extremely concerning, in part because of some of the other things that I'm going to talk about, which is one, identification of documentary heritage. So I talked a bit about the large volumes of data that documentary heritage organizations are attempting to parse through to identify what is the historical record. Now, there's a big discussion in our community about compensating around bias in order to make the record more representative. But this in some ways is skewing the historical record to make it say what we want it to say, and not necessarily representing the historical record and its bias for what it is. So there is really some ethical discussions that I think we could benefit from talking with Software Heritage about how do we accept bias? How much bias do we accept? How do we compensate? Can we compensate for the bias in a historical record? What impact does that have on things like social justice, on law, on all of these different aspects of applying AI within our context? Because we could actually be damaging what we remember and how we remember it. We need to be careful about that. Also, there's the issue of sensitivity review. What is open, what is closed? A lot of organizations, because they don't have an approach to be able to identify sensitive information, are closing records. This is having a huge impact on what is accessible from accountability and transparency perspectives. And we need to develop an approach, a more sustainable approach, to ensure the accessibility of the record. Access of documentary heritage. Incredibly important when we talk about AI. There are collections of records just because we don't have resources in documentary heritage institutions. We need AI to help us to make them accessible. I'm thinking of photograph collections, audiovisual collections. There is work happening in this field. So I cite National Archives of Indonesia that's been working on with researchers to make their photograph collections accessible using AI machine learning technologies. I cite as well Swiss Federal Archives that has done some really interesting work to make their audiovisual collections accessible using artificial intelligence. So I think there are really opportunities here, but we also need to be careful. We need to be careful that we're not biasing our accessibilities requirement or our accessibility of archival records by preferencing certain things in different collections. So we need to be equitable in that process. And finally, there's also preserving documentary heritage. There's definitely a role for AI in that space. I think it's much more limited at this point from what I can see around making sure that we have automatic flags to let us know when we may need to do a preservation intervention for obsolete formats or at-risk formats. So in conclusion, I think that there are huge opportunities for the documentary heritage profession to be able to work with the Software Heritage Network and Symposium, and also other colleagues at UNESCO to be able to develop approaches and methodologies that ensure a sustainable and robust approach to the application of AI within our context. And I'm hoping that we will be able to work more closely in future. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthea. Much appreciated. David, let's end with you. If I might, ask you to be as concise as possible. I'm sorry. We need to be winding up. David is going to talk about preserving and interpreting software history at the Computer History Museum. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much. I know that everyone has been waiting all day to hear from a historian of computing, so I'm very happy to provide that for you. I'll cut my remarks in half and see if that helps with the schedule. But thank you all for the opportunity to participate today. I'd like to introduce the Computer History Museum to you all and discuss how our diverse efforts to preserve and interpret the history of computing, especially the history of software, how they're complementary and I think deeply sympathetic to the goals and activities of both software heritage and also UNESCO's Memory of the World program and this ideal of documentary heritage. So Computer History Museum, its origins go back to the 1980s. The current organization dates to the 1990s. It's in Mountain View, California, which is in the heart of Silicon Valley, and it's a nonprofit independent museum. We enjoy a very diverse collection. We have a huge collection of 3D objects, which I could talk a lot about, but today I'd like to focus on our archival collection. I think that's more to the point today. Our archival collection ranges across audiovisual materials, extensive manuscript archives, born digital files of all different types, an oral history collection with over 1,000 oral history interviews that are the transcripts and the video recordings of which are freely available online, and software that we view very much as a genre of documentation. We have a large archival collection of software and software in all of its diverse forms. Executable code on every type of storage medium, historical and contemporary, and also source code as both digital files and as paper documents. And one of our activities with source code is our source code release series. And in this, we work to collect and make public online source code that is particularly developed in proprietary environments. So we work with companies like Apple, Microsoft, Adobe, IBM, Xerox, Google, and others to identify extant source code of important products and to move to help the companies release this source code to the public with the museum. And these are very intensive sort of craft efforts. They take years, sometimes more than a decade, to secure the public release of this source code. So we're very proud of that program. Oh, another one of our activities around executable code is a practice that we called video ethnography. The historian, very famous historian of computing, Michael Mahoney, described that the true object of computing is a dynamic object consisting of software, hardware, and humans all working in action. And kind of motivated by that view, we have done a series of projects where we take working historical software, working historical hardware, and a working historical person, somebody who worked with the software, often one of its makers, to do extensive video documentation of such a working system in practice. We've done this extensively with the Xerox Alto system and others, and we make that video documentation available in our online public catalog and on YouTube. There's a lot I could say about how we exhibit the history of software in our exhibits that are both physical and online, like our newest exhibit, which is on Chatbots Decoded, Exploring AI, which is a sort of history of chatbots from ELIZA to LLMs. But I think in the interest of time in the schedule, I will leave it there, but maybe just point out some challenges that what we see as the most significant challenges for the sort of work that we're doing. This is just the proprietary environments for the creation and deployment of software that makes collecting and interpreting software very difficult. Corporate disincentives and risk avoidance for making software that was developed in proprietary environments public, and intellectual property law as a real impediment to preservation and interpretation. So with that, I will turn it back.
Thank you so much, David. There you have it. So let me just thank Charles, Anthea, and David for their participation in this panel. And let me hand over to Moderator.